So President Biden threatens consequences for Saudi Arabia after they decided to cut global oil production. This includes Saudi Arabia's OPEC allies.
And I am in the process when this House and Senate gets back. There's going to be some consequences for what they've done with Russia.
What kind of consequences? Menendez says suspend all arms sales. Is that something you'd consider?
I'm not going to get into what I'd consider and what I have in mind, but there will be consequences.
Two countries have applied for membership, Iran and Argentina. Technically, both of them fit the bill. They're emerging economies.
Who signed strategic partnership agreements, and according to the Saudi state media, the meeting between the two leaders comes with agreements close to $30 billion in sectors including green hydrogen, information technology, transport and construction.
The world's largest oil producer, Saudi Arabia, is reportedly asking to join BRICS. The regional bloc, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, has been touted as a serious counterweight to the Western-led world order.
Hello everyone. Ever since U.S. President Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia in July this year, the speculation of the Chinese president's visit grew. As the year draws to its culmination, Jinping visited the kingdom and signed a series of bilateral agreements, symbolic of deepening ties between the two countries. It is also to be noted that Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Saudi Arabia with too much fanfare, unlike the tepid reception received by the U.S. President Biden during his visit to the kingdom. During Jinping's latest visit to Riyadh, Saudi and Chinese firms signed 34 investment agreements in green energy, information technology, cloud services, logistics, medical industries and infrastructure. These agreements will strengthen economic ties between the two nations, as well as bring Saudi Arabia into the fold of China's Belt and Road initiatives. Currently, China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade worth $87.3 billion in 2021. China and Saudi Arabia's growing closeness comes at a time when relations between China and the U.S. are as hostile as ever, and ties between the Saudis and the Americans have grown sour following the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Chinese-Saudi relations are strengthened in these tensions, with the Saudis seeking a reliable alternative to the U.S., and China wanting to rival the Americans in their diplomatic and economic strength. And also, after catching much headlines over oil production cuts in OPEC Plus ministerial meetings in Vienna, and facing allegations of joining Russia's camp over the war in Ukraine, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia once again shocked Western countries, especially the United States, by expressing a desire to join BRICS. So, why is U.S. so concerned about China-Saudi Arabia ties? And why does Saudi Arabia wants to join BRICS? Also, how does it will impact India? Let's find out. BRICS is an association of 5 major emerging economies worldwide, including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It was established in 2009 to serve as an alternative to the West, and counter Western hegemony in geopolitics, and the global economy under 3 pillars, of political and security, economic and financial, and people-to-people contacts. Ideologically, BRICS advocates for multipolarity and cooperation in international politics. So one can understand Riyadh's bid to join BRICS through multilateralism and national interest. The kingdom is a petro-state, and earns 80% of its export income from oil. According to the Brookings Institute Report 2020, in the medium term, revenue from oil export is expected to decline due to expected reduction in global demand by 2040, which will affect their economy. So to reduce oil dependency and diversify its economic resources, Saudi Arabia launched the Saudi Vision 2030 program, in which their main focus is on diversification of the economy, by investments in education, health, infrastructure, and tourism, which requires multilateral cooperation on the international stage through various forums, one such as BRICS. The kingdom is also trying to be a part of broader non-Western partnership arrangements, to have more diplomatic space in the current fractured world order. The Saudis are keen to move away from the shadows of American hegemony. This is evident through the yuan-priced oil agreement with China. In short term, Saudi Arabia is looking to diversify its partnership with other international players. But why BRICS? And why now? Well, as we all know, Saudi Arabia is one of the most powerful nations in the world, and it has always been the closest ally of the United States of America. However, Saudi Arabia is currently involved in a Cold War with the same United States, because Saudi Arabia reduced oil output by 2 million barrels a day. As a result, the price of oil shot off from $91 a barrel to $94 a barrel. As you see, this action was tremendously profitable to OPEC nations, but it caused mayhem in the West. In response, President Biden warned Saudi Arabia with unclear repercussions and even offered passing the No OPEC bill to challenge Saudi Arabia's security, which began violating the petrodollar agreement between the U.S. and Saudi. So if you don't know, as per petrodollar agreement, Saudi Arabia will sell oil only in dollar, and in return US will provide security to the nation. It's the agreement of the century, as it gave the US the dollar power over every nation, making it the most powerful economy in the world. But, as soon as Biden started to violate the agreement, in exchange, Saudi Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, made a major step that sent shivers down the spines of Americans, which was his proposal to join members of the BRICS. Previous year's data states that Saudi has started making defense deals with both China and Russia, so that they are not overly reliant on the US. Secondly, the Biden administration wants to relax economic sanctions on Iran, Saudi Arabia's opponent in the Middle East, and the third reason is the oil consumption of BRICS nations. Resulting in Saudi Arabia, the world's top oil producer, allegedly proposing to join BRICS, by which they will have the backing of China, Brazil and India as the biggest consumers of oil in the world. Well, you might be thinking, so what, Saudi Arabia is joining BRICS? It's just a group of only 5 nations, what's so special about that? And why the US and the EU are so terrified over Saudi's proposal? Well, BRICS is an alliance of the world's 5 major developing economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Most people underestimate it since it includes emerging economies as opposed to established economies in the G7. But these 5 countries account for 41% of the world's population and have a combined GDP of over $24.4 trillion. They also have a substantial military capability and an increasing political influence in the global sphere, and by teaming together, this group commands a voice for itself in the global sphere. It helps them to have wiser worries about emerging economies whenever the West implements policies that are explicitly beneficial to itself, and a famous example of this is the carbon tax. The European Union routinely complains about the carbon emissions created by the Indian and Chinese steel industries. As Western industries are adopting to clean energy, they are now going to apply a carbon tax, so that when Indian and Chinese steel enter the global marketplace, their products will be taxed penalties precisely because of more carbon emission than these developed countries. However, developed nations have generated so much carbon during their development phase that they are primarily responsible for climate change, yet they ignore the past and now impose a tax on carbon emission, when developing countries needs economic fuel to thrive. So the expansion of the BRICS needs to be considered based on the forum's founding principles. The grouping has emerging economies with the potential to shape the world order in the future. It was seen as a bulwark against Western groupings such as G7. As at that time, the latter groups were accused of favoring the interests of Western powers like the USA and Europe, sidestepping the core interests of the global South. There was broad discontent across the global South that BRICS countries representing half of humanity with a substantial addition to the global GDP did not have their definitive voices at any post-World War multilateral institutions. But if at all BRICS decides to expand its membership with Saudi Arabia, the first thing that will take place is that it will stop petrodollar recycling. Saudi selling oil offers the US a $7 trillion advantage, which may form a bilateral currency exchange deal, under which the BRICS countries would not have to buy oil in dollars, especially India and China, the 2 largest users of oil, leading in the collapse of the American economy. The US will experience a significant blow since China alone owns $1 trillion in US treasuries. Without buying oil in dollars, the Chinese may sell those bonds, putting a dent in the American economy. So even if China merely withdraws its treasury bonds, the US will have $1 trillion less in bonds. On the other hand, President Putin has declared the formation of a new international currency known as the BRICS currency, which is extremely helpful to India, China and Russia. The BRICS currency is on its way, and according to Putin's declaration, it will function as a basket holding the value of 5 BRICS currencies: the Chinese yuan, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, the Brazilian real, and the South African rand. This basket would make it semi-decentralized and more stable than the US dollar, and to top it all off, analysts believe that the currency could be gold-backed to give it even more strength and stability. The BRICS states have also announced the creation of a parallel bank with a $150 billion capital as a competitor to the IMF. Only President Putin knows how this BRICS currency will emerge and function as an international currency, but on the outside, what we need to know is that, if the BRICS succeed in designing their own currency, for the first time in half a century, we could once again have a currency backed by gold, which would almost instantly make it the most valuable money on earth. And if Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS, it will be gold and oil that will lay the foundations for the BRICS currency. Which is why the entire world is watching what Saudi Arabia does, and how it will change the world order with BRICS. Also, India has a delicate role in this issue, to include additional members in the BRICS forum. First, being the proponent of multilateralism and expanding its ambit to other non-traditional actors, it must maintain the status quo or move toward expansion. Second, in recent times India-Saudi Arabia ties have deepened further with the visit of several high-level political leaders and officials from both sides. The country needs the Arab nation to safeguard its energy security ambitions and for the welfare of its large diaspora. Third, Riyadh is consequential for New Delhi to maintain its influence in the volatile West Asia region with its own domestic and international issues. That will undoubtedly test India's stand in the BRICS ministerial meeting, where it has to contend with other member nations like China and Russia as far as the expansion of BRICS is concerned. Well, it goes without saying that a stronger BRICS means further dividing the world into two large blocs. As a result, two opposing economic and financial poles will eventually emerge. The first will be led by the Western camp, which currently controls the levers of the global economy. The bloc includes Japan and Australia, while the Eastern power base is formed through the BRICS economies, despite the presence of Brazil in their midst. The United States' position as a global hegemon will not change overnight, but as China and the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia's growing relations with BRICS nations, exhibit the winds of change seem to be blowing hard. This means an intensified geopolitical competition ahead. Is this the end of American hegemony? Will there be dominance of Eastern power after a century? What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in comments.